Hello everyone and welcome! Today I'm excited to introduce an all-new 3D printable 1/24 scale front suspension and steering assembly, creatively named the FC01. This video will serve as an introduction to the FC01. I'll be talking about the design and assembly process, and I'll also answer some frequently asked questions and talk a bit about some future plans. Now a fair warning, this video will be a bit on the nerdy side. No real building, jumping, or crashing into wafer cookies in this video. So for any casual viewers on my channel, feel free to skip this one and come back next week for your more typical RC content. Though if you have any interest in building one of these assemblies, definitely stick with this video till the end. So with that said, let's dive right in. The FC01 project really began earlier this year. The 1/24 scale, fully FDM 3D printable FFR SC1 chassis that I'm sure many of you are familiar with has been a big success, though many builders, myself included, wanted a more scale-looking and functioning front suspension. While the FF01 seen here is solid, durable, like really durable, it's easy to 3D print, functions great, and will continue to be a nice option for many builds, the FC01 was going to be different. We wanted something that looked much more like the real thing. A simple double control arm front suspension that wouldn't look out of place on a vintage muscle car, hot rod, or race car. So with the idea in mind, we put together a list of requirements, as well as sort of a wish list if you will, which included make it as scale looking as possible, it needs to be FDM 3D printable, has to have a low profile unlike the FF01, also it needs to at least have the option of having a front mounted steering servo, there needs to be the ability to fit bodies with different widths, needs to be compatible with pre-existing FFR SC1 and FP UC1 chassis. There should be ways to incorporate the assembly easily onto pre-existing model car chassis and custom-made chassis. Should be relatively easy to put together. Any parts that cannot be FDM 3D printed should be easily and inexpensive to obtain. For example, the axle shafts are just regular M2 bolts, and the ball sockets are made from 1mm rods and jewelry beads. No custom CNC parts or non-standard hardware. And finally, this assembly should be a successor of the previous MC01, which cannot be FDM 3D printed, at least not by design. Quite a list, but with the goal in place, the design process began. Here you can see some of that design process. I was actually able to sort of rough edit the majority of this assembly in a single afternoon. The next day we had some functioning prototypes. We've since made many revisions and added lots of little things, and we're still tinkering with it, but it has been cool seeing it come to life so quickly and actually work pretty well just on the first try, which was a huge motivator. As you'll see a little later, these parts are just about as small as you can make them and still have them be printed on a hobby FDM printer. Maybe you could go smaller and thinner, but not by much, I don't think. We had some micro hardware and other junk laying around the shop, which I made this design around. In a perfect world where I have tons of time and deeper pockets, I'd probably order like every kind of micro ball joint and micro hardware piece that I think might be applicable here, but in this situation I got my hands on some tiny little jewelry beads and some 1mm steel rods and thought I could make a little ball joint out of that, so I did, and here we are. It works, it's super cheap, and it's in the maker spirit, I guess. Now over on Patreon, you'll find a list of all of the hardware and non-printable parts that you'll need, as well as links to where they can be purchased. Some of these parts we offer on our website, though some we do not. At some point we might put together a non-printable parts kit, just like we have for some of our chassis, but right now you'll need to order these parts individually. Again though, the list we provide makes getting everything that you need very easy. In fact, not just that, but over on Patreon, you'll find an entire page or tab, I'm not sure exactly what Patreon calls it, but you'll see it there at the top of the main page labeled FC01. Simply click that and any post related to the FC01 front suspension assembly will be on that page. It's nice and organized, and it should be easy for anyone to find the post that they're looking for. Of course, along with the STL files, you'll find tutorials, videos, and other helpful information. As always though, please do not hesitate to send us a message if you can't find something. We're always happy to help out. So as for the design, I'm using Autodesk Fusion 360 to create what you see here. Especially recently, I've been getting asked a lot about what software I use and what software I recommend. For mechanical designs like this, I like to use Fusion 360. I've used it for quite a few years now. It works well for my needs and fits into my budget. For more organic designs such as a car body, I will use Blender 3D rather than Fusion. I would definitely recommend Fusion 360 to a beginner or hobbyist. Now, I have gotten some messages from folks saying that you have to pay to use Fusion 360 now. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but when I go onto the Autodesk site, it still shows that Fusion 360 has a free for personal or hobby use option. So while presumably there is limited functionality, you can still use the software at home for personal use, such as designing your own RC car parts, at least as far as I can tell. It's been years since I've used the free version of Fusion 360. It certainly seemed just fine at the time. Maybe things have changed, so if that is in fact the case, that you have to pay to use the software now, or the functionality is absolute crap otherwise, or something like that. As far as what free good for a beginner or hobbyist 3D modeling software would I recommend? Well, I really like Blender. It is free and open source, but it's not really intended for mechanical design like Fusion 360 is. I'm sure it could be done, and there are probably some plugins that add certain functionality that could be helpful for mechanical design, but I really think of Blender more like character modeling or more free-form organic design. Like I said, I'll use it for making car bodies, but it's much more of an artistic modeling tool than a CAD. A while back when I was getting started, I used FreeCAD a little bit. I generally preferred Fusion over it. I used Design Spark Mechanical as well, but it's been a while, so honestly, it's hard for me to really recommend anything other than do some research and see what other hobbyists are using. But anyways, once the design was to a certain stage, I began 3D printing a number of prototypes. Now, as stated before, every single plastic part of this assembly can be FDM 3D printed. We've had success printing these parts on $2,000+ machines, such as this Maker Gear printer that you see here, and we've had equal amounts of success printing these parts on printers priced close to $200. Now, don't get me wrong, more expensive printers certainly do have their advantages, but if you think you need to spend thousands just to get into the hobby of 3D printing and start building cool projects such as this, that is simply untrue. With this said, however, if you don't have much experience printing tiny objects such as these on your printer, expect there to be some trial and error and some experimenting being required. These parts may be printable, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're easy to print. At least for me, by far I had the best success when printing using a 0.2 or 0.25 nozzle. Others have said that they've had success with larger nozzles. I would still really recommend using a smaller size nozzle, again such as a 0.2 or 0.25. However, of course, feel free to experiment for yourself. Of course, once you get all of the parts printed, next you're faced with the challenge of actually assembling the suspension. In this video, I won't be going into much detail on how to assemble the suspension, as I've already put together a nice little video assembly tutorial series over on Patreon. Obviously, if you're actually in the middle of putting one of these together, go check out that series for detailed step-by-step instructions. As for a more general take on the assembly process, well, determining how well we met all of the requirements stated earlier in this video will be up to you all. However, I think one requirement that may prove to be a little out of reach is making this assembly easy to assemble. I think the biggest challenge when putting together the FC01, at least for me, is the ball joints. As I said, every single non-printable part of this assembly is just generic hardware, bearings, and other similar off-the-shelf stuff. This isn't like some of the micro RC cars where they have custom-made ball joints where the ball end can be screwed right in with a hex driver. This assembly gives you the joy of doing it yourself with a 1mm steel rod and a spherical jewelry bead of all things. You just glue that little jewelry bead onto the rod and bam, you've got a ball end, which you can glue to the knuckle or wherever it's needed. It's strong, it's dirt cheap. I mean, you can get hundreds of beads and many millimeters of steel rod, like enough to make ball ends for literally over a dozen of these assemblies for like the same price as maybe 8, 12, 16 of these ball ends. And that's if they even make them as small as these ones here. They might not even sell ones that are 2mm in diameter. So cost and function-wise, it's a win. But assembly-wise, well, get out your magnifying glasses and don't drink 3 cups of coffee right before you put these together. It can be a little tricky, but it's certainly doable. Fortunately though, aside from those ball ends that I was just talking about previously, it's pretty much smooth sailing after you get the ball ends put on, at least for me anyways. There's this kind of annoying part here which holds the bottom side of the spring that needs to be glued to the lower control arm to make the lower control arm easy to print. I mean, it's not hard to do or anything, it just kind of seems like an afterthought, and yes, that's coming from the guy who made this design decision, but I don't know, it does work, I guess. Maybe we can figure out a better way to do this, but certainly in its current form, the benefits of making the lower control arms easy to print outweighs the minor annoyance of having to glue this on, which really you just put down a little glue, get your tweezers out, and put it in place. Not really that hard at all. But once the suspension assembly is complete, it's got a nice scale look, and there's some different frame options that can be used to secure the suspension assembly to a pre-existing chassis or even incorporate it into your own custom chassis or a model car kit. You're going to see some examples of incorporating the suspension assembly into some custom chassis and even a model car kit chassis in some upcoming videos. I've featured one car that I've built using this suspension assembly, which is this 1968 Shelby GT500, and there's a lot more projects featuring this FCO1 on the way, definitely stay tuned. As of releasing this video, version 0.1 of this assembly has been posted on Patreon, link is below in the description. As stated on that page, there are several areas we're working on improving, as well as some more variations and accessories for this assembly is in the works. Of course, be on the lookout for new versions in the future. One of the cool things about 3D printing is that we can always update the designs and add new parts and make improvements, and just with a few clicks you have access to these updated designs, no retooling necessary. Now with all this talk about 3D printing, some of you may be wondering if we'll be selling these assemblies as physical kits. We haven't really decided whether or not we will yet. If we do, they will likely be made in limited batches, and it won't be until later versions have been released, where bugs have been worked out and the assembly has been improved as much as possible. With 3D printers becoming better and less expensive, and as a result more hobbyists than ever having access to them, it just makes a lot of sense to really focus on expanding our catalog of STL files and offering them for a modest price, along with plenty of relevant videos and tutorials. If you are interested in a kit or fully assembled FCO1, feel free to send us a message. If the demand is there, we can certainly build a batch of them and see how well they sell. One frequently asked question that I talked about in one of the GT500 build videos was whether this assembly would work well for drifting. The short answer is no, I highly doubt it, because for drifting, you need some serious steering angle, which this assembly comes nowhere near to getting. It may be possible, but that wasn't really what this assembly was designed to do. But for what this suspension assembly is designed to do, it's been proving to be an awesome setup, and I can't wait to see what you all do with it. Be on the lookout for some updates and future builds featuring this suspension assembly. Of course, once again, the link to the STLs is below in the description. That's going to be all for today's video. I hope you found it informative, and as always, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.